Right. Then, without further ado, I would like to welcome the first speaker of the affirmative team to open their team's case.
Yeah. If you would like, we can move the camera.
Yeah, maybe that's a bit better.
Hang on.
We've become accustomed to it. Maybe this is why we keep losing. Sorry, Tim.
The only thing going through my head right now is Korean. I'm spreading blood all over my page,
And then if you want to see it's bleeding. And then put the pan in this laptop. And then you.
Oh, it's on the live stream.
Hey?
It was on the live stream that you said that.
Your little bomb.
Oh yeah, it's right.
Oh my god.
That's right. Hi, Mum.
Here we go.
Can you play?
Yeah.
That looks good to me.
I moved myself. So leave the speaker on the big room. This is just the cameras. Yeah.
Move that closer to you.
That's the speaker.
That's a mic.
Oh. So many of the freedoms that we enjoy are due to us having a functioning democracy. This means is we have representation, accountability, and participation. It means that you are not marginalizing minorities because one party can abuse power. If you were to stand beside negating today, you would be standing with the side that marginalizes minorities, that abuses power, and wrecks democracy at its fundamental core. So what are a few things today? Firstly, sit up, and then second, two points of substantive. One on how we get more representation in our world, and a second on how we get better accountability. So firstly, sit up. What does this look like? What do you think that these democratic pillars look like? So we think this looks like a lot of coalition governments. We think this looks like the filibuster, where you need 60 votes as opposed to 51 to ram through legislation. And this means that we think this looks like assigning opposition members to cabinet so that they have a say in making decisions about legislation. So how does this force function? How does it work? It means it forces bipartisan negotiation. Why is this? Because you need people on the other side of the political aisle to agree with you, to help you push the legislation through, to help you make these changes, and you can't do it without them. It means that you need people to vote for your decisions, otherwise you will not get any legislation done, and the government has an incentive to do this, because otherwise you will not remain in power for very much longer. Note that in most democracy systems, whether it be first past the post, MMP, or STV, you only need like 51% of the vote to pass things through. Otherwise, you fail the other 49% of the population. Most voters only vote on a few issues. This means that even if you have the 51%, you often fail the 49% because the 51% and 49% agree on much more things than you are willing to admit. So what do you think the counterfactual looks like? It means that we think that on the gaming side of the house, you don't lose all accountability, but you lose a lot of it. If you don't have the opposition party within your corridors of government, if you don't have them within your Supreme Court and building coalitions, it means that you lose a lot of the accountability, the checks and balances that I'll talk about a little bit later on today. Also, it means that you're only ruled by two or even one party in the entire political system. This is because there's no point having small minority parties if you're not going to have any say in the government. It's only going to be two majority parties. So I'm going to make first attempt why we get more representation. Note that like most elections in democracies are won on the margins. It's very marginal. It means that people skew left or right depending on how the political landscape when it comes to election time. This means that political parties need to capture and represent the middle block, and so therefore only win usually on a 51 to 50 something percent of the vote. So thank you. So how do we get more representation on our side of the house? Two mechanisms for this. Firstly, you have to negotiate. This looks like, as I explained, having the filibuster. It means that you have to go to the other side of the house and talk to the people who disagree with you politically to get concessions so that you have your representative of more of the wider population in the wider community with your legislation. This works because it means that, as I've explained, you have to make concessions, you have to sometimes lose out on what you wanted to do so that you can actually pass the legislation. As I've explained, you have the incentive to do this. This means you want to stay in government. Secondly, you're less likely to get a polarized government. Now, in elections, you have to stand for the most moderate policy. Otherwise, you tend to get votes out on the margins. This means that you have to cross the political divide, and it means that when you're standing for elections, it means you're less likely to propose policy that is on the extreme left or the extreme right. Otherwise, you stand a much worse chance of getting into government in the first place. So what are some of the outcomes of having more representation on our side of the house? Firstly, it means that we feel one of the main burdens of our case today. It means it shows that we get the best form of democracy on our side of the house. As I've explained, the three pillars that make up a successful democracy: representation, accountability, and participation. So firstly, we get better representation, and from this we get better participation because people feel like their vote actually matters. They feel like when they go to the polls, when they go to the booth and cast their vote, it means they feel like their vote is doing something to affect change in this world. I'll take it for a while before I move on.
Don't you think that this looks more like actually having these people in Parliament like it looks like in the Northern Ireland government?
Well, I can't say I'm familiar with the Northern Ireland government, but I think that it means that, as I've explained, it means you have to make concessions when you're in Parliament. You have to get more than just 51% of the vote to pass the legislation, etc. So on to my second substantive on how our side of the House reduces abuses of power and increases accountability in government. So what do you think this abuse of power looks like? We think it looks like a lot like overreach by your government to make sure that they stay in power. It means that we think that they make policy that makes it harder to vote in anyone except them. This looks a little bit like Turkey, where Erdogan has made policy, for example, that makes it really hard to get other opposition parties in. It's jailed a lot of his leaders, etc. So a few mechanisms on why we get less abuse of power. Firstly, when bad things happen, on the negative side of the House, by contrast, there's nothing in place to stop it. On our side of the House, it means that if you have opposition parties within these corridors of government, it means it looks like at the worst, you slow down the progress of these really bad policies and these overreach of power and this abuse of power. It means that when you slow down this progress, it means you can get social change to happen, which can force this government out. But even at the best, if you take us at our best, it means you stop this legislation entirely. It means that they don't have enough votes. It means they don't have enough to affect this overreach of power, of abuse of power. So this is how, and in countries like Turkey, for example, it means it will prevent democracies moving to dictatorship. Now, why is it likely that a government is likely to abuse its power if there are no political incentives not to? Firstly, we think that a government wants to stay in power. This means that they're going to do a lot of the policies that I talked about before, such as court packing and extending terms, to make sure that they stay in power for as long as possible, because being in power has a lot of extra benefits to their government. So what are the outcomes of this? As proven, we get the best representation and participation, as proven substantive 1. But on substantive 2, we also get the best accountability, which also helps improve our burden, to alleviate our burden, which means which is having the best form of democracy on the outside of the House, which is something that is exclusive to the affirming House today, and is why you should stand aside of them.
Right, thank the speaker for their speech, and would like to invite up the first speaker of the negating team.
Giving this kind of political power to opposition parties destroys the fabric of our democracy because it halts progress and it ignores the voices of the people who actually voted them, and it discourages people from actually voting in their elections. 4 things I'll do in my speech today. Firstly, I'm going to give you some context and characterization about what we think either side looks like, because we don't think we had enough of that from side affirmative. Then I'm going to give you some responses to the material that we have from first F. Then I'll bring you 2 substantive points. Firstly, why giving power to opposition parties blocks progress, and then secondly, how giving this kind of power results in bad elections where we have extremist policies. Right, so before I do that, I'll tell you we win today's debate by proving that we get better functioning democratic governments and more democratic governments. Right, set up. Let's talk a bit about what it looks like on our side of the House. We think that to be giving significant political power to opposition parties that look like those norms of bipartisan coalitions, that's going to be a norm in the MMP system if they want to talk about that, where like National and Greens have coalitions there. But we also think as this appointment of powerful roles in the executive, exactly what it looks like in Northern Ireland, where they have to have the First Minister and the Deputy First Minister be from a member of a Unionist party and a Republican party, the next biggest one, right? It also looks like in Lebanon, where they have to have those 3 most powerful roles being filled by someone who's Sunni Muslim, Shia Muslim, and Christian, right? So that's the kind of thing here. It's a much more extreme than what ACT is trying to say, and what that means is that it's going to push a lot more things. What we support on our side of the House is we're supporting opposition benches and parties that are going to be scrutinising what the government's in place, and we think they can do that through media attention, no thank you, or through like, obviously because they're just on the opposition bench, right? Cool. So let's respond to what we have from first ACT. First, they responded to their setup by saying it actually has to look a lot further than to be able to give them significant political power, and if they're not giving them significant political power, we think that just like squashes the vast majority of the benefits that they can try to get there. But now let's talk about how they think they can get more representation. What we tell you is that firstly, under this kind of negotiation and like with filibuster mechanisms and things like that, we tell you that concessions don't actually exist between these political parties because it makes them look weak, right? And the example of this is exactly what I can use, right? Because we don't see any kind of policies actually getting pushed through in the US where they do use filibusters, right? Where we saw a massive infrastructure bill from Joe Biden get entirely struck down by Republicans in the Senate, despite how it improved the lives of millions of people, right? What this means is they're not actually getting good representation because those people who voted for Joe Biden to push those policies through about infrastructure and voted for those senators don't get their voices heard and don't get those kind of bills pushed through. So it's actually significantly worse. And we also tell you that we see worse of those power abuses because those oppositions can execute those things like power and those filibusters. No, thank you. Right. How we get giving these power to the opposition parties blocks this progress. This is basically just an extension of that rebuttal that I gave you. But the context here is that these opposition political parties do have the power to block the legislation when they're in those executive positions, right? Basically, I'm going to prove that too much power to that opposition party impairs the parliamentary system and important progress can't occur, which then undermines the democracy, right? So why are these opposition political parties incentivized to be blocking this? A few reasons here. Firstly, they just don't agree with the policies, right? Because parties, when they campaign, they do so on opposite ideas, right? So they can have different values, so they can differentiate themselves from the public. It means that if they don't agree with that policy, they're going to exercise that's passed by those in government. The opposition is just going to use that to veto. Even if they do agree with the policy that's getting pushed through, no thank you, they're still going to veto it because they want to align with what they campaigned with so they can look the most trustworthy to their public, right? But then secondly, because they want to they also do it because they want to just undermine the looks of that government, right? Because that political party in power looks really bad when they can't get any any kind of material through, right? If they can't get these bills or get any change for that country, it looks really bad for the political party in power. So the opposition is incentivized to block it, so it makes them look like they're not getting any change. It makes them look like they don't compromise enough, so that opposition party can go and get in power themselves. Thirdly, they just don't trust that government to be making good policy, right? It's the reason that they're in the opposition party, because they think it's the better party. They just think they're smarter people, and so they think that any policy that comes from that main government is going to be a bad idea. But even if they don't block the progress because they're incentivized to, we think it intrinsically happens anyway, because being able to criticize so much that it entirely stops those decisions just slows decisions being made significantly. We think this criticism can be good, but they just, like, the opposition party just criticizes the most irrational things of these bills and means we can't get anything through. The comparative here is when they don't have that kind of institutional power, they're not able to block this kind of important bills that get pushed through, right? And it means they're still able to provide criticism through the media and through the opposition bench to make sure that main government in power is thinking about their policies, but they just can't stop it from happening just because of their own party incentives. The outcomes here, this is so important, right? Because it means that laws don't get passed, like life-changing things, right? This undermines democracy because these parties were elected into power to actually make the change that they campaigned on, to actually make that promises, right? An example of this is like the majority of Ireland voted for Sinn Féin, probably because they don't want amendments to the trading bill between Northern Ireland and the UK.
On that point.
But the DUP is still able to hold Sinn Féin hostage and not form a government until Sinn Féin agrees to go and amend that kind of policy. That's really bad for our democracy because the majority of people do not vote to support that, and yet that's something that could get pushed through anyway because otherwise our government literally does not get formed, right? We get policies that get entirely undermined, like those infrastructure bills, like housing policies, they just agree with because they're on different sides of the political spectrum. We win this is winning material because obviously it just undermines the democracy. That's how we fulfill our win conditions. I'll take a POI now to try to
You say that parties don't like to make concessions because it makes them look weak. What makes the party look weaker? Not passing any legislation at all, or passing legislation with a little bit of bipartisanship and concessions.
They don't make these concessions because it makes them look weak, but because those opposition parties demand like a lot of change, right? It's not just a little concession that they accept, because of all of those mechanisms that I gave you, they want to really push it so that they pretty much can't push the same bill through at all, right? How we actually get really bad elections here. Basic thing I'm going to prove is that it means that parties run more extremist policies and we get really poor campaigning. So, 3 mechanisms here. Firstly, both parties run really extreme policies when they campaign. In instances when they do have to compromise, which we don't think is very often, but they run these extremist policies so that when they actually have to compromise, they look like they're going in the middle range, but they're actually running really like far right things that actually kind of like persecute minorities or persecute poor people and things like that, right? So and then when they don't end up compromising, they can push through those extremist policies. On our side of the house, they actually aren't incentivized to be running those extremist policies because they don't have to make so many compromises, and they can actually push through what they were running on to be able to win, right? Secondly, they don't campaign to the other side because the opposition will always be getting in, and that same party will also always be getting in. So those two parties care less about having the overwhelming majority of the vote because no matter what, they're still going to be conflicted with that other party there, right? So they care less about trying to reach out across other sides of the political spectrum. So they end up just pushing more policies that go to that side, whether to the left or to the right. On our side of the house, they get more seats and they get more power in the government every time they get more of those votes, so they're more incentivized to cross the floor. What that means is that we get more extremist campaigning on our side of the house. They push more radical policies that persecute marginalized groups, and that's going to undermine our democracy and the worst governments.
All right. We thank the speaker for their speech, and now invite up the second affirmative speaker to continue the debate.
by the. Sorry. So he's being on Zoom and doing my general rhetoric or give me a hand wave or something. That's all good. Okay. Today and they just fundamentally face an uphill battle because they need to prove that democracy should only represent a majority, that even a small marginal benefit to the minority is something that they couldn't stand by on their side of the house, because that is what we were standing by today. What am I going to do for you today? Firstly, I'm going to deal with the clash over who gets the best outcomes to democracy. I'm going to explain why our thrust in the debate is able to stand. I'm going to explain why their material is very extreme and just a bit ridiculous in the motion in the debate as a whole, right? And then finally, I'm going to extend off the first point. I'm going to explain particularly why we're able to achieve this specific representation for minorities, why that's so important in the debate today. What's our thrust on prop today? We give you a couple of things, right? We tell you firstly, we give a thrust on representation. We tell you we get better bipartisan negotiation. We tell you we get better vote out. We tell you, I'll further extend off this at by split for the specific minority groups. What's the response we hear out of bench? We see reasonably limited responses, right? We see very surface level analysis. They're we told you filibuster as an example. They're yes, the US has a filibuster, right? But they don't they still have all these problems. They don't have this bipartisanship, right? We told you that was just an example of the norm, right? We tell you because of that, right, they don't have all of the other parts of the norm that we were suggesting that would be encouraged under your side. That was only a small subset. In all of the other things, like having coalitions, like all the other examples we gave you, right? They miss out on those. So because of that, just saying, the US doesn't do it, is just very surface level analysis and isn't able to become the mechanisms we bring you in a manual. Also, they want to tell us that you're going to get massive you're going to get massive you're also going to get these massive concessions are going to just be seen as weakness, right? Two responses we give you there. Firstly, we tell you if it's the norm to be having to negotiate with the other party to have these concessions, right? That probably means that if every party's doing it, it probably doesn't seem that weak anymore. And if it does, it just balances out as an on-net harm. It mitigates out on both parties. Second, we tell you there's just no reason they gave us for this. They gave us no mechanisms why it seemed weak. We give you a couple of reasons now why it probably looks as a strong move. It means you're probably confident that your party is able to win the next election while able to extend out a hand and negotiate with the other party. It means that you're able to probably negotiate, and win over voters on the other side of the divide, and you're able to just be mature enough that you don't be the US politicians sitting around and just not wanting to agree on anything. That seems really petty. That seems weaker on our side. So that responds to our representation for us. We're probably able to uphold that. Secondly, we have a point on accountability we bring you. We tell you you're able to slow down, you're able to block things that are very problematic. That looks like things like the Justice Party in Poland, who are doing massively problematic things, like stacking their courts, doing extending their term limits. Those are things that are massively harmful to democracy in the state. We hear no response out of Kara at first on that. Look, what do they have as their thrust? They say it's going to be a huge shift in policy, right? We tell you, what's our response to this, right? We tell you that's just not what the world looks like. We told you in our model we were going to give them some limited powers, right? That probably means they were going to get a couple of things through. It probably wasn't going to be as much power as the majority had. We told you it was going to be it was also going to be used as a limited restricted power, right? Because no party is going to just turn around and change all of their policy, right? That's not what we're standing for. It's a bit of a ridiculous characterization from their side of the house, right? Because what we're actually standing for is just a bit more bipartisan negotiation, a bit more of a slant towards the centrist view, right? Then they're laws can't be passed on your side, right? We tell you that it's completely against the incentives of the parties to just be stuck in the ground and not move and not pass any policy, right? A couple of reasons for that. Firstly, we tell you it's very harmful to be seen as blocking the other party, because the other party comes out and this side of the Senate is blocking all of our policy. That's massively harmful to their reputation, because everyone's well, even if you're on the Republican side of the house, right? Well, that's probably pretty problematic, right? And it comes round and swings round and roundabouts, right? Also, we tell you that when it comes to it comes round and swings round the other way, and you're in the majority, right? The other side probably doesn't want to negotiate with you, so you probably want to strike a balance between you, so that you can both push through policy, you can both be reasonably reasonable, so you can actually get a successful democracy. Because even though you split on what you think is best for the country, you probably still both think that passing some policy is probably a good thing, and you probably have the outcomes of the country as a good thing on your side of the house. Also, we think democracy was built to represent all, and we do that best on our side. Then they bring your point, and they say that they're going to run on very extremist policy on their side of the house. But this directly contradicts our mechanism, so it implicitly responds to it. I'm going to deal with it now because it takes up one of our mechanisms. Look, what's our response to that? So we tell you that you don't actually, so they tell us that you're going to have to, they're going to have a very extreme policy so they can work back to a reasonable concession, right? Look, two responses to that. Firstly, let's say we believe that's the case. Let's take them at their best, right? We tell you on our side, they put extreme policies, then they negotiate it back to a reasonable policy, right? Because they have to make these concessions, right? Then what does that mean? Is pass through in the end. It means reasonable policies pass through every single time, right? On their side, look, maybe they get less extremist policy in some cases, but if they ever are able to get extremist policy on our side, their side, there's no accountability mechanism to walk that back. That's really problematic. No, you don't just want to talk about the first world efficient democracies, right? You want to talk about like corrupt democracies here that are sometimes misfunctioning. That looks like President Erdogan in Turkey is doing massively problematic things that are beneficial to him, but probably aren't beneficial to the majority anymore. That's massively problematic in this debate. I'll take a PI from them now if they've got one.
Yeah. Considering in the US that often because of the polarization between the Democrats and Republicans, important policy like infrastructure isn't passed, how does that deal with your material when you talk about this?
Literally, I think the US, using the US as an example about cases fundamentally flawed. I just explained that before at the start, why they didn't like fill up like full like extent to our norms. Secondly, we tell you, we think we're on our side, because you now have to negotiate, because we give the Democrats, because you give the Republicans some level of more power. I've just given you all of the mechanisms that like of why that's like probably true. I'm not going to jump back and give you like more analysis because like that example is like implicitly responded to by like whoever wins the debate, right? Okay, now I'm going to move into my split material, my substantive contributions debate. Why are we able to best represent minorities? A little bit of context, right? These are often marginalized communities. Institutions that democracy is built on is often built on like things like colonization, things that have often marginalized these groups. Often, we tell you, there's like a massive like distrust in like the systems, not only the government, but also like the systems like the medical system and justice system that come off that. I'm going to give you a couple of mechanisms why we best represent minorities, why that's so important in today's debate. Firstly, we tell you, they feel like they're more represented, right? Why is that? Because we get the smaller parties that are able to now have some level of bargaining power in the government, right? That means they feel represented, right? We tell you that means they're actually represented as well as that. We tell you this like extends off the benefit at Emmanuel of having these smaller parties for two reasons for you. Firstly, why are they not actually able to run off major parties, as they're probably going to tell you in their analysis in response to this, right? We tell you why they can't join major parties is because the moment that you have to make a decision between trading off their voters and this minority, right, they're instantly going to opt for their voters, even if that's a slightly bigger majority, right? That looks like the Labour Party trading off like moldy voters who have voted for them and made up a significant chunk of their voting block, but then they traded them off because their majority contrasted with them, right? We tell you, they also, secondly, feel more represented because they're more able to engage in the government system at a higher level, right? What does that do? That has flow-down effects to lower levels of government, like the justice system, like the medical system, that could give them actually substantial help, could actually make their lives systemically better, but they're very distrusting of their systems. Now when they feel they've got like some level of representation in the higher government levels, they feel like they can trust these lower levels a lot more. We tell you, you get the best outcomes because of that. So then, what am I able to prove to you in my case materials so far? I'm able to prove, first, that we get our thrust, we get the best accountability, the best representation, best participation in this debate. What am I able to prove on them? That their characterization is a little bit ridiculous, that their like analysis that the US is a bit like is a bit of a like surface level responsiveness to our case material. Then I'm able to extend and prove why minorities are so important in this debate.
Right.
Is that my answer?
We thank the speaker for their speech and invite up the second negating speaker to continue their team's case.
Good luck, soldier.
Sorry about this.
It's all good.
I've lost. Oh, I've got it. Right. Okay. So far in this debate, AF has framed and characterized this motion in an incredibly charitable way for their side of the House, even though the way in which they've done this is actually super disingenuous, not in the spirit of the motion. A few things to do in this speech. Firstly, I'm going to discuss why we will not get any legislation through Parliament. Then secondly, I'm going to discuss why we do not get more representation, especially for minorities who may be marginalised. Then thirdly, I'm going to discuss why we get generally worse elections, right? Firstly then, let's quickly clear up some characterizations. So we want to note very quickly that coalitions are not exclusive to the AF side in this debate, because we tell you that the motion specifically states that we support giving opposition parties significant power. We tell you members of, for instance, a coalition in New Zealand, like when the Greens and Labour and New Zealand First were in a coalition, none of those people were opposition. Those parties were all in government. So we tell you, like, we can have coalitions on our side of the House as well, right? I think that what we're really talking about is those other, is like things like the filibuster and stuff like that, right?
Oh, sorry, motivation.
No, thanks. Secondly, we tell you the kind of places in which this exists are not these super like autocratic governments or these super corrupt governments, because we tell you in those instances, governments who have a lot of power will literally just like leverage that power to get rid of these kinds of policies which give their oppositions any kind of power, especially if there is so little accountability as there is in these super corrupt governments. So like this debate just does not exist in those kinds of instances. We're talking about way more liberal countries with more functioning democracies where there is way more
on that point,
where there's just like a lot more accountability, right? Firstly, let's talk about blocking progress. This is substantially the most important point in this debate, because we don't think any of this, their points about like representation or participation actually matter if we don't get through any kind of legislation which may benefit minority groups, right? So we gave you a whole lot of points at Cara about why governments do not want to look weak by conceding anything, right? We told you that they just like fundamentally believe that they are right. We told you that they don't want to look weak to their voters, because we tell you voters should just like really care about their governments. They're like parties looking strong. We think that they care about their parties,
on that point,
no thanks, differentiating themselves from their oppositions at the point at which they make those concessions. They just look a lot more similar to their oppositions, and so they're going to like lose a lot of voters, right? The responses here were firstly that like there will be a norm of compromise. We tell you that that's like, yeah, in a world in which this policy exists, there will be a norm of compromise. In a world in which this policy does not exist, there will never have been a norm of compromise. Secondly, they tell you that these parties, they also tell you these parties like won't necessarily just like block all of the other bills which are brought up by their opposition, right? Because they tell you that both sides just agree on some things. We tell you in the instance in which both parties agree on some things, those kinds of policies are going to be passed in our world as well, just because like the assumption is then the government still agrees on it, so that is just like moot in this debate. So what we basically tell you at the end of this point is just like, so what we tell you essentially is just all of the stuff around that we gave you at Cara about why these parties care substantially more about their reputations, care substantially more about looking really strong, still stands. They haven't engaged with the actual mechanisms. Because what did we tell you at Cara? We told you that these governments care about looking really strong. They care about differentiating themselves from their opposition. In a world in which they make all of these concessions, they actually like look substantially weaker.
On that point,
they look like they are like giving in to the opposition. This is especially harmful in super polarized countries. Like look at, for instance, Democrats and the Republicans. We think that the US is generally a super polarized country. We think that in that kind of world where one party is seen to be making a whole lot of concessions. Their supporters generally will not like that, so they're just going to stop supporting them. Parties know this, so they're going to continue to push against that kind of legislation. I'll talk about representation in just a minute.
What thing would party members prefer? Parties to be in power or to just make a little bit of concessions?
Can you repeat that, sir?
What would party members not prefer? The party to be in power or government, or the party to just make a few concessions?
We tell you they probably would prefer to be in power, but we tell you in the instance in which they have a very, very minimal amount of power, or like they have like less power than the actual government, they're like probably not going to like that. They're still going to want to be the government, right? Okay, secondly then, representation. This is basically their substantial push here. They tell us that like having more parties cooperating and stuff like that means that you get more representation, especially for minorities. Our response to this is basically just like the second largest party in that country, which is realistically going to be the person representing the opposition, is just going to be like another super like party which does not represent like specific, for instance, ethnic or religious minorities, because they still represent a majority because they are still a super big party. Like an example of this is, for instance, if we had this kind of system in New Zealand, the opposition would massively be like, either National or Labour, neither of these parties, so they have a huge incentive to cater to specific minorities because they just care about catering to the majority, which is white. So they just right, so we tell you that like maybe there are smaller parties within these kinds of governments who do care more about minorities, but we tell you in those kinds of instances, those opposition parties just have substantially less power, so they're not the kind of parties that are going to be able to push through or block harmful legislation. We also told you like all of this stuff at CAR's second about how parties just do not feel the need to campaign for like these kind of minority groups because they probably know that they're going to get a level of power anyway. What that means then is that they just feel a whole lot less desire to campaign for these like very, very specific minority groups because they know they're going to have the ability to block legislation anyway. They know they're going to have the ability to like have their voice heard anyway, so they don't feel the need to do this, right? Finally then, on participation, this is finally then on participation, right? So over here we heard basically more people feel represented, therefore more people will engage in the democratic system. We tell you a couple things. Number one, we tell you people become substantially more disillusioned with the system at the point at which it's incredibly deadlocked, at the point at which they feel like their vote has literally no impact because the two big parties are going to get in anyway. We tell you in a world in which that election feels substantially more competitive, and there is actually policy being pushed through by a party which has like complete power. We tell you that people just feel a lot more motivated to vote for the party which they care about and to like engage in the election, right? Oh yeah, the outcomes. We also gave you like these points around how people just do not feel, yet again, how they don't feel the need to campaign to a lot of people. The outcome of this was essentially like a way more poor campaigning. Finally, I want to give you this very quick point on extremist policy, right? Because we told you that like parties will feel the need to push their policy really, really far and like to the right or the left, so that when they pare that back through compromise or something like that, assuming that they do that, it just looks a lot more, looks more marginal, it looks more centrist, right? The response was basically like, yes, they will negotiate it, and then the policy will become more reasonable. But what we tell you is that this policy will always be more extreme, because assuming that we're making like the same amount of concessions in either world, we tell you like at the point at which that policy starts, super, super far right or super, super far left, no matter like if you're making the same number of concessions, it's just always going to be like substantially more to the right or substantially more to the left. And these parties always look like they're making way more compromises than they actually are, the point at which they're misrepresenting their own policy by positing like super extremist policy, right? So what we tell you at the end of this debate is that we get we get substantially more participation on our side of the house, which is one of Act's like tenets of democracy. We do not get more representation on their side of the house because these minority parties are going to have super, super marginal, if any, power. And we also tell you that we actually get policy passed on our side of the house.
Okay. We thank the speaker for their speech, and we now invite up the third affirmative speaker to continue the debate.
Three things in this speech. Firstly, on efficiency, policy implementation. Secondly, representation of minorities. Finally, extremism and abuse of power. But first, an important clarification to make. The push we get at second neg that opposition parties are like only directly opposing views. I think that is false because by necessity, opposition means like the definition of opposition means that you are running against one another, that you are all vying for the same thing. E.g., if I am like running a cross-country race, every single runner in that race is my opposition. It isn't just parties that have directly opposed views. Pretty disingenuous there. Okay, on efficiency then. They tell us that because these parties don't agree with policy, they're likely to halt the efficiency of that policy. Yes, they don't agree, but we think they still get into power. When they still want to get into power, they still want to be able to make change, they're willing to compromise. Why do they actually want that policy through? Firstly, I think it looks really bad to your voters, the point at which you aren't able to achieve anything. I think there's a direct government countervailing incentive to like push out as much policy as you can, even if it isn't as as you intended. You still want to get that because you still want to get in power. Secondly, they probably care about the issues, so they're willing to compromise to get any sort of change that they can get. Finally, I think even if these politicians exist in like the we are right vacuum as the negating team thinks they do, they have like systems of advisors and surveys which show that they should take any change and they should be willing to compromise in order to get into power in the next election. But we think you're still able to compromise because we don't think every system is inherently polarized. Some you'll be willing to compromise on some views, e.g. like not getting full healthcare, but that looks like only like heavily subsidizing rather than like fully subsidizing it. They say you undermine the looks of the government. Elliot deals with it pretty well. He tells you about how when every party does it, you now normalize this norm on our side of the house. We actually look at this analysis here. We tell you it looks stronger than able to actually pass policy to appease voters. You get those outcomes that people want. The countervailing incentive here far outweighs that norm. Finally, they tell us you're incentivized to because you just generally think it wrong. Again, I kind of dealt with that in that analysis, but we think they would still have the capacity to break down those barriers and actually have the ability to compromise. They can cooperate and work together, and again, there was those countervailing incentives. What that means is we probably got more participation because people actually felt like their votes mattered and they actually were able to get their views across. But I don't think the affirming team and the negating team here are able to prove their key path to victory of getting like huge efficiency because the kinds of arguments they were saying were so implausible. Obviously, governments still wanted to get some policy passed. I don't think that stood. Okay, secondly on representation then. We told you the negotiation was more in coverage, so you were going to get better representation of the vast majority of societies within political spheres. What response did we get from side negative? They told us that firstly, you're going to get gridlocks, you don't actually get any of that representation. I think that is all contingent on analysis I've just dealt with, but I also just want to flag here that gridlock is probably far more likely on their side of the house. We literally have parties advocating for like reform and on policies and changes in the opposite direction, and they weren't willing to compromise at all. That is where you actually get gridlock in this debate. Secondly, they told us that concessions like just simply aren't going to exist. Again, dealt with that. I think all of that is to say that we also get less polarization because parties were more willing to cross the floor and advocate only less polarized policy. in the first instance, but also on minorities. We probably got better representation for minorities because they were more likely to opt into other systems, to the point at which they were able to join the majority party and they actually get their views heard and actually get policy. They tell us that they don't campaign, but they don't do it. Again, continuing analysis. The second kind of push here was that the Māori party is too small to actually influence any change. Firstly, the minority parties on our side of the house are still included in coalitions. They still get power by necessity. We think that's what this motion was intended, because they're now able to join into coalitions because opposition parties have to be included. But we also think that was uncomparative. Given that on our side of the house, we had the ability for minority parties to be involved in that political sphere, on their side of the house, they were systemically shut out. Before I move on, a POI.
What does a normal bipartisan coalition look like for your side of the house?
What does it look like? It looks like parties being more willing to compromise on views. It looks like parties having the capacity to compromise on their views and actually, but they still had the capacity, the incentive to get policy across. We still thought that you were more likely to have parties that wanted to kind of create change in the world, but still have some capacity to have better representation for the entire society at the point where they could get better representation. That means that we've got parties that were more willing to work together. That means more cooperation in times of crisis, yet less civil disruption because of the harms of polarization that necessitate on their side. Okay, finally, on extremism and abuses of power. And this is where I think this negating team really falls down. We told you that representation opposition parties gave us far better political leverage to prevent the unchecked abuses of power that occurred on their side. What engagement did we get from Team Wellington? They tell us that oppositions have the capacity to create abuses. Responses. Firstly, I think in the vast majority of cases, well, not the vast majority, but a large proportion of cases, right-wing parties have the upper hand within that political system and better political programming. Why was that? Firstly, the constituents were more likely to be wealthy, so they could get more donations, they could run more sophisticated campaigns. Secondly, they were more likely to do things like targeted advertising because they weren't seen as PC, didn't have to wear gear for those left-wing norms. Finally, you could run really manipulative populist campaigns and sensationalize things of the left with disproportionate powers. All of that is to say that if you are a centrist or a left wing, you get slightly influenced policy. Okay, maybe you have to remove some spending for important issues, but I think that's far better than the comparative where this debate takes place when we have opposition parties that can never be checked and can truly abuse those powers. We think that you got less of these extremist policies in the first place because of the analysis we gave you all the way back at Amanda, and we're going to get less polarization, and opposition parties and political parties have the incentive to cater to the views of their opposition parties. I think they also deterred that because if you are the right-wing party and you're unchecked, it looks really bad on voters for centrist. All the benefits that Emmanuel gave you still materialise, and they still had the capacity to protest because we were able to intervene in that first instance. All that meant we got horrific abuses were not unchecked without the majorities of power. And when we got less things like constitutional amendments, less horrific abuses for minorities. In the worst case, you bring huge awareness to these issues that without them being able to silently pass these policies without actually having to be accountable. Look, democracy was never going to be perfect on either side. The question became, what world would you get a more representative system where powers could not go unchecked and you have better capacity to get bipartisan representation of policy that people wanted? Proud to propose.
Alright. Thank the speaker for their speech, and now invite up the third negating speaker to close out the substantive portion of this debate.
when you allow the opposition party to have too much power in government, you get something like the American political system, where important legislation like the Women's Health Protection Act that increased abortion care and supported pregnant women when they had to get pregnancy leave gets vetoed just because the opposition party doesn't want to cooperate with the government. Look, SciAv told us today that the US government is a bad example in today's debate because they're a bipartisan coalition. But they're actually a perfect example because they show how a bipartisan coalition just fundamentally doesn't work because important policy never gets pushed, never gets passed, and that is when we ultimately just don't get policy that represents the public and the people. What I'm going to do is three things in this speech. Firstly, I'm going to talk about how bipartisan coalitions hinders the operations of Parliament. Secondly, I'm going to talk about representation. And then thirdly, I'm going to talk about how it creates bad elections. So first on how it hinders the operations of Parliament. Look, this is the most important point to prove in today's debate, and we can win on this by showing that ultimately what happens is if a government can't work together functionally because an opposition party doesn't want to compromise, then we don't actually get any important policy passed, and then we don't get all the benefits that they talked about, such as representation, such as accountability. So let's talk about why they don't compromise. Look, they told us at their first speech that we get negotiations and we get concessions on our side because they have to work together. Look, we've given you 3 important responses down the line why this just simply isn't true. We told you that we just don't get concessions because often what these parties do is they campaign on completely different issues, very vast secret political ideas, so they can differentiate themselves. What this means is that when it comes to actually voting, when it comes to working together, they're not going to because they just have completely different political ideologies. So it often means that we're going to just have people veto policy that is veto policy because they don't agree with it or just for the sake of it. But we secretly told you that they would just veto important policies, these opposition governments, that the governments, opposition parties, because they just want to undermine the government. They wanted to make it look bad so that they look stronger for the next election. This is where we heard responses. What did we get? We heard that they would first of all not do this because it makes them look confident for their next election. Look, the reality is that when you work together with this government, what it tells to your opposition party members and your voters of the opposition party is actually that you're working with the government, and what this means is that you're on the government's side to these hardcore voters. What it means to them is that it doesn't show that you're confident in winning the next election. It shows that you're confident in the current government and not your own opposition party, and therefore people are going to just continue not to vote for this current government, which is not what your party wants. You want them to vote for your opposition party in the future. What else did they tell us? They told us that they just seem petty on their side, on our side of the house, if they just don't cooperate. Look, the reality is that they just it doesn't matter to them if they look petty because they're just going to vote for it because they already have the power. They're just going to do what they want anyway. But secondly, if they won't look petty, the people who are going to look petty and weak is the government, because what it does is it shows there's not going to be scrutiny to the opposition party. The scrutiny is to the government because people are going to be like, oh, the government can't get legislation passed. The opposition party probably could, because it's not ultimately the opposition party making the decision, the overall decision at the end of the day, but they influence it in the end, and that is the issue. But the third thing they told us why we would get concessions and compromise is that they still want to get policy passed. But I think it's clear in this debate that look, we agree that they do want to get policy passed, but the issue is if they only want their policy passed, that they have simultaneous incentives where they want to make the other government look bad, they want to promote themselves. So what would happen when they're in these power roles is that they will only promote their own policy from their opposition government and not work towards any beneficial policy for the other government. What this ultimately means at the end of the day is that they just are unlikely to make concessions, but if they do make concessions, they're going to be so minor that they actually just don't actually create any new any more representation. They don't actually benefit anyone because they're just tiny representation. So what it shows is that this is the most important point at the end of today's debate that we've shown to you, because it shows just policy is going to be inefficient and it's not going to be representative, and if it's not representative then they just get none of their benefits down the line. So then let's talk
On that
about the
point-
next point on representation. Look, they told us that they get representation in today's debate because they now have minority parties involved, and it's just not another big moderate party just having moderate values, and that we get to see some more perspectives. 3 responses to this. Firstly, often this just doesn't consider that the opposition who is part of the bipartisan agreement could just be a massive other moderate party, which means that we're still going to have just moderate policy push. This is an example like the US, where we have Republicans and Democrats. Both of them are bipartisan, and we just still have moderate policy push on that front. But secondly, let's take them at their best, and we say that we have minority voice expressed. Why is this actually harmful? It's things when something like NZ First gets too much power, when they only represent less than 2% of the population, and they decide who our next government is going to be. They decide get rid of policies like a capital gains tax, which most of the public actually wanted and doesn't actually reflect most of the public view. But we thirdly say that it also means that we give not only more representation to minority helpful parties, but we give it to minority parties who have extremist views too. In coalitions, we give it to power to minority parties like Advance NZ, who just don't reflect the public, and they just don't have a very they're more extremists on the line of politics. I'm taking now.
What checks exist for government who does not have to cater to opposition parties?
Look, we think that what exists is the status quo, which is the opposition bench who get scrutiny by just having debate in parliament chambers. So you get scrutiny there and adjustments to policy. But secondarily, we get this scrutiny in terms of media, where these opposition parties go to the media and they talk about the issues to get change. We still get change in our house, and we still get scrutiny to policy because the opposition bench still functions in parliament. At the end of this, what it shows is that, look, representation can actually be harmful and hinder government. And we think that often representation, and why we have majority governments, is because what people want is a government that best reflects them and is the most democratic. What is undemocratic is having a party like NZ First dictate the entire election, dictate policy push, because they aren't actually representative of the government. So what we're showing to you is that we actually are more representative of the population. But even if we're not, like I said again, our most important point is that we hinder the operation and the functionality of government because they just don't get laws passed in the first place that represent these people. Finally, then, on how we create bad elections. Look, they told us this material on accountability, that they just make policy harder to get pushed. The government makes policy harder for opposition to have voters, get voters, and get into government. 2 responses to this. Firstly, look, this is looking at instances where states are authoritarian, because obviously they just don't want voters in. So they just don't want democracy. So what this means is they're probably just going to remove this policy in the first place to have a opposition party has significant power. So we think that pulls out the debate. But secondarily, we said once again, we still have more accountability on our side because we have an opposition bench who has scrutiny in parliament chambers, who has scrutiny through the media. We get actual representation. We get legislation actually. That is what we're doing on the side of this.
All right. Thank the speaker for their speech. And as always, we will now reverse the speaking order and invite the negating team's leader to reply.
Northern Ireland literally cannot form a government right now. Millions of people have never felt so. Oh wait, no. Sure.
Do you want to restart on that? Yeah.
I spoiled to my intro. I'll just restart. I'm so sorry for that. I just saw the mute button and I thought you were. Okay, we're gonna start again. Oh, now I have to be serious again, Sophie. You can't do this to me. Okay. Northern Ireland literally cannot form a government right now. Millions of people in that country have never felt so unsure about the future of their leaders because the DUP, as an opposition party, are able to hold hostage the formation of their parliament because they get that powerful role in the executive. This is what ACT has to defend on their side of the house. This is their burden to prove. It is a good thing today. It's absolute chaos is what it is. I'm going to do two things in my speech today. Firstly, I'm going to talk about what we think this kind of looks like and what these norms and institutions look like here. Then I'll talk about how the opposition's party act and what that then means for the rest of our material. Right, so what does this look like? What we've told you is that norms of bipartisan coalitions look like norms between like national and Greens coalitions, about that kind of cross sides of the political spectrum organisation. We think these roles of executives are also a really important analysis for side affirmative to be talking about, right? Because these powerful roles in the executive looks like how the opposition party in Northern Ireland gets the Deputy First Minister's seat. We think they have to engage with material and reasons why that's good if they want to be able to win today's debate, because it's really important to what it looks like to have those norms, but it's also essential for them to be able to actually get the benefits that they're trying to push. Right, so let's talk about how these opposition parties act. We told you that these opposition parties, with this kind of power here, and don't kind of block this material going through, but also they're not going to be willing to try and cross the floor and make those bipartisan coalitions that ACT wants to try to get on that side of the house. We gave you a few reasons for this. Firstly, because they can make the government look incompetent when they just don't push this policy through, right? I gave you this at first. But even if it's not so like nefarious intense, right? They still have campaigned on completely different issues. They still wanted to differentiate themselves and continue to want to do that to their voters, right? Or they thirdly just like disagree with those policies and think that government isn't very intelligent and think that they make silly policies, right? So what this means is that they kind of block all of these things that come through. They don't actually support going through these coalition parties, and none of that action actually happens, right? We had a couple of responses from side affirming on here. Firstly, they said you don't want the opposition party to treat you the same once you're in power, right? We gave you some responses here at Sophie. She told you that these opposition parties that are currently as the opposition party think it is a threat to them getting back in power if they don't go and block that kind of material, right? Because if that policy does well, it's a really good reflection on that current government, so it probably makes them more likely to be re-elected in the opposition's eyes, right? And they also have to act now, and otherwise they look weak, right? They look like they agree with the government's policies and they think that government is intelligent, so they believe that that's actually going to make it more likely the current government gets re-elected the next election cycle. So because it's a current threat to their re-election, that's entirely what they focus on, and so they go and block that stuff. But then she also told you that with the policy, they also said that they want this policy passed, but Sophie responded to this by saying they only want their policy passed, right? They don't want the opposition's policy passed. That's why they didn't campaign on the policy that opposition party is trying to bring. So what this means is that this really important material just gets entirely blocked, right? Because they're able to do this. We don't ever get these kind of coalition things. We get these people in these executive power seats being able to just stop that material going through. But even if it does go through, it's just so minor because it just gets mitigated by the power that the opposition has in these kind of coalitions, right? But we also told you that this kind of separatism behaviour actually makes really poor campaigning, right? Because it means that they campaign on more extremist things. It means that they push further to the sides of the political spectrum. This means that they go out and these policy parties publicly go and actually speak out against those marginalised groups. That makes it worse for the minorities against what we heard on that side, right? They also don't encourage people to vote because they think these groups are already going to be able to make it into power, so people don't even bother to engage with that political system. What this means is that ACT side actually do incredibly awful with the functioning of democratic government, and they lose democracy if they want to have their policies on that side.
All right, thanks, Speaker, for their speech. Invite up the leader of the affirmative team to close up the debate.
Look, I might have tried to run some big swing case material in my time on our team, but people like John and Emmanuel have stopped me running that. My coaches have held me accountable for that. These are the opposition parties. These are what they look like in government. They stop me running big swing material in the same way they stop them running extremist policy, right? Look, at their best, they work in a world where we have functioning democracy. What do we get in that world? We still get a better representation. We still hold them accountable. But at their worst, right, what they're looking at is dysfunctional democracies, where you get breaking down of justice, when you get the Justice and Peace Party in Poland rolling back widely supported abortion regulation, extending their term so they can't be held accountable by the total bloc, right? What's the clash in this debate? Going to deal with two of them. Firstly, which side gets the best representation. Secondly, the handbrake on democracy for how you're going to stop just absolutely crazy policy going through. What's our thrust on representation, right? We bring a thrust that we get representation, we give you bipartisan support, we're going to get a better voter turnout, right, in the polls, right? You've already got Emmanuel's mechanisms on your paper, you've already got the extension material I brought you a second on that. We also extend that with the minority split I just told you about. What do we have as an op thrust on this point, right? Op tells us that concessions make them look weak, so they can't pass laws. That's the key thrust on this point, because if they fail to prove, if they're able to prove that we're inefficient, that's massively damaging to our case material, right? What do we have in response to them, right? These firstly tell you that when it becomes a norm, it becomes more of a normalized thing to cooperate with the different parties. Secondly, we tell you that even if you don't believe that, right, we tell you that their parties are just going to call them out for blocking, right? We tell you moderate voters, we tell you that at third, that moderate voters are often the swing voters in these debates, in these voting blocks, right? And they get really upset when people are just generally blocking policy for what seems like no good reason, right? Thirdly, we think we characterize at second for you what the incentives of these people are. Even if they wanted to pass the policy that their party was, they fundamentally probably cared about the country, right? That's why they've gone into politicians, right? We tell you that's so important because they'd rather see a little bit of policy that was not that great for their party pass through, rather than literally just seeing their country fall to pieces. That's why in the US, the budget eventually always gets passed. There's always concessions. That's why that happens. Then they're like, but it's so different. They're so different that they can't find a center point, right? We told you, when we have these norms that force them to find a center point, right? It forces them to be more concessionary. It forces them to have more moderate policy, right? We tell you, you can't just say democracy will just break, right? Democracy will find a way around. Parties will find a way to function because democracy just won't instantly fail on our side of the house, right? Then extremist policy is going to happen on your side because you have to start extreme now because then you've got to walk your policy back, right? We give you great response to this, right? We tell you firstly that on our side, we gave you a little bit of world building. On our side, maybe they start off a little bit more extreme, but eventually they get walked back and you roll out regular policy, right? On their side, if at any point you get this extremist policy, there's no mechanism to walk it back and get centrist policy, right? So that actually probably plays into our hands. On that point, we're able to prove that we get our thrust in this debate, able to win on that clash alone. Secondly, there's a point on the handbrake on corruption, on the power abuse in the system, right? Note, this is so fundamentally important in this debate because these are some of the worst harms, particularly in corrupt democracies, particularly in dysfunctional democracies. We hear two responses. Firstly, at third neg, we hear that they'll go out to the opposition and out to the media, right? We tell you this was new material on their bench. I can't engage with it because I'm in my leaders, and neither could any of the rest of the teams. You shouldn't take that into account on your sheet. Secondly, we tell you that even if that was able to come out earlier on the bench, we tell you all you hear about is that functionally it has to work because otherwise what's going to happen is you're going to have this failure. Look, they tell us that there's no democracies out there like this. This is a very niche example. We give you examples like Poland, like Turkey, like Pakistan, like Sri Lanka. These are all many democracies. Not every democracy is a first world functioning democracy, right? So we tell you so many democracies like this. We told you that at John. We told you shift to a failing democracy, right? We told you it also exists in places like the US when Trump is court packing. We told you that at Emmanuel. So overall in this debate, we're able to prove if you either believe that we're able to put a handbrake on corruption and democracy, or you're able to believe that we get the best representation, the best accountability, the best representation in this debate.